My dad turned to drinking and criticized Mom after her brother cheated us, causing us to lose land. I am Mary, a sophomore in college, and my life today feels like a shadow of what it once was. Just a few years ago, my family embodied the warmth and joy that I believed would always define us. My father, a robust man with an infectious laugh, was the kind of dad who would spend hours in the garden, teaching me and my younger brother, Alex, the names of all the flowers and how to take care of them. My mother, a gentle soul with eyes that seemed to hold endless kindness, made our small, cozy house a home with her loving touch and the heavenly smell of her cooking. Back then, the future seemed bright. Our little family was tight-knit, bound by love and shared dreams, especially after my parents managed to buy a hectare of land from my uncle, my mother's brother. That land was more than just soil and greenery. It represented a legacy, a future where our family could build and grow, both literally and metaphorically. We envisioned a small family farm, maybe a few rental cottages that could nestle in the shade of the large oak trees dotting the landscape. It was a symbol of stability and hope, a tangible piece of prosperity that promised to anchor our family for generations. My Uncle James, my mother's younger brother, had always been a charismatic and persuasive figure. Growing up, I saw him as a fun-loving uncle who seemed to breeze through life, always with a ready joke or a small gift for me and Alex. He was a frequent visitor in our home, his arrival often heralding impromptu barbecues and late-night storytelling sessions. My mother adored him. She often spoke of their childhood adventures with a fondness and nostalgia that painted my uncle as not just a sibling but a hero in her eyes. This deep familial bond made him more than just an uncle to us. He was an integral part of our family fabric. My parents, especially my mother, trusted him implicitly. This trust was rooted in decades of shared history and mutual support. When Uncle James spoke, his words carried the weight of sincerity, or so we believed. In hindsight, the signs of his financial instability were there, but they were subtle, overshadowed by his charm and our trust. He mentioned struggles now and then, hints about the economy, bad investments, the rising costs of living, but they were always presented as temporary setbacks, nothing a good next move couldn't fix. So, when Uncle James offered to sell a hectare of his land to my parents in 2013, it seemed like a golden opportunity. The land was located on the outskirts of our town, a lush expanse of green that bordered a small forest. My parents had always dreamed of owning more land, perhaps starting a small organic farm or building a few holiday cottages to rent out. The land my uncle offered seemed perfect for such dreams. The deal was straightforward, or so it seemed. Uncle James explained that he was selling the land because he needed liquidity to fund my cousin's college education. He painted a vivid picture. The land, once developed, could be the foundation of our family's financial security. My parents, eager to invest in our future and to help my uncle, agreed to buy it. The price was reasonable, the terms favorable, and the paperwork appeared to be in order, except for one detail: the Red Book, the official document proving land ownership, was still under the bank's hold due to a small loan my uncle had taken out. With reassurances from Uncle James that the loan would be cleared within a year, my parents proceeded. He crafted a promissory note, a casual yet seemingly earnest document, wherein he vowed to clear the debt and transfer the Red Book to my parents as soon as possible. Trusting him, they paid him the money, believing that the formalities were just a formality. Months turned into a year, and the promised Red Book did not materialize. My parents grew anxious, but each inquiry was met with reassurances and new promises from Uncle James. He always had a reason for the delay: paperwork snafus, bank errors, bureaucratic red tape. But his charm and our family's trust in him kept my parents from pressing too hard. This pattern continued until late 2018. That was when everything changed. The financial bubble that Uncle James had been inflating burst with shocking consequences. It turned out that the initial loan against the land was just the tip of an iceberg. Uncle James had been drowning in debt, far more than he had disclosed. In a desperate move, he had taken out further loans against the land, each one a deeper cut into the trust my parents had placed in him. The final blow came abruptly. Uncle James declared bankruptcy, and within weeks, we learned that he had fled the country. The news was delivered by a bank representative who arrived one crisp autumn morning to place foreclosure signs around the hectare that we thought was ours. The bank explained that the land was heavily mortgaged, far beyond its worth, and would be seized to cover my uncle's debts. The revelation shattered my parents. The betrayal by someone they had trusted so deeply was a wound that went beyond financial loss. My father, particularly, felt deceived and humiliated. He had advocated for the deal, swayed by my mother's trust in her brother and by the dreams they had harbored for that piece of land. The loss was not just a plot of earth, it was a future they had envisioned and promised to us. As the legal reality settled in, so did the bitterness. My father's sense of betrayal morphed into a festering anger that found its easiest outlet in my mother, who, despite being a victim herself, bore the brunt of his accusations and grief. The man who had once been the life of our family gatherings was now a source of tension and despair. In this new, harsh light, every memory of Uncle James was recast. The laughter and gifts, once signs of his generosity, now seemed part of a facade that hid his deceit. His stories, once enchanting, now felt like manipulations. The trust that had once bound our family to him had turned into a chain that dragged us down into a mire of betrayal and regret. The descent into despair was gradual at first, like the slow setting of the sun before darkness fully takes hold. My father, once a pillar of strength and joy in our household, succumbed to the weight of his disillusionment. His days began and ended with the bitter tang of alcohol, the bottles accumulating like silent markers of his decline. He no longer tended to his business, a small landscaping company that had flourished due to his love for nature and his dedication to his craft. Instead, he let calls go unanswered, projects unfinished, and slowly, the vibrant man who had raised me with laughter and lessons in resilience, succumbed to a listless apathy. It was not just the loss of the land that broke him, but the betrayal by his own brother-in-law, and the crushing responsibility of having convinced my mother to trust her brother. In his eyes, his failure was twofold. Not only had he failed to protect our financial future, but he had also placed his faith in a man who destroyed us. This sense of failure consumed him, leading him to relinquish all his hard work as if in surrender to an unseen foe. He wandered through his days like a ghost, his presence marked more by the trail of empty bottles than by any interaction with us. My mother bore the brunt of this transformation. The sharp edge of my father's tongue turned against her in his darkest moments. He accused her of complicity, of knowing her brother's intentions and yet leading us into ruin. His words were like daggers, and they sliced through the fabric of her self-worth every day. "Your family is a bunch of scammers," he would shout, the alcohol fueling his anger, turning it into a wildfire that consumed any remnants of peace within our home. Despite the onslaught, my mother's resilience was something to behold. She absorbed the verbal blows with a kind of stoic grace, her eyes often wet with unshed tears, but her posture remained unbroken. She became the buffer between my father's wrath and the rest of us, especially for Alex, my younger brother, who was just entering his teenage years amidst our family's crisis. Alex's rebellion against the situation was fierce and protective. He could not bear to see our mother demeaned and insulted. His confrontations with our father began as verbal skirmishes, challenging the unfairness of his accusations, defending our mother's honor with a boldness that both scared and awed me. "Stop blaming Mom. She didn't do anything wrong," he would yell back, his young voice cracking under the strain of his emotions. These clashes often escalated until the house felt like a battlefield, the air so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. Witnessing these exchanges tore at me. I was caught in a relentless storm of emotions, anger at my uncle for his deceit, despair over my father's downfall, and a deep, gnawing pain for my mother's suffering. Each evening, as I heard my father's slurred accusations and my brother's desperate defenses, I felt a part of my heart crumble. The helplessness was overwhelming. I was a spectator in my own life, watching the people I loved tear each other apart. My mother, amidst this chaos, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She went about her daily routines, cooking meals that none of us had the heart to eat, cleaning a house that no longer felt like a home, and trying, always trying, to mediate between my father and brother. Her efforts were Herculean, and yet, I could see the toll it took on her. The circles under her eyes grew darker each day, her smiles more forced and fleeting. She often pulled me aside, her hands clutching mine with a desperation that was hidden from the others. "Take care of your studies, Mary. Don't worry about us," she would whisper, her voice trembling. But how could I not worry? How could I focus on college applications and exams when home was a place of war? The weight of her suffering became my constant companion. I lay awake at night, listening to the echoes of their arguments, and wondered how much more we could withstand. The fear of the phone ringing with news of something worse kept me on edge, a perpetual anxiety that gnawed at my concentration, my peace. In those moments, when the house finally quieted down, I would find my mother in the living room, staring out the window. Sometimes I joined her, sitting in silence as we both lost ourselves in the world outside. It was during one of these silent vigils that she finally broke down and shared her deepest fears. "I'm scared, Mary," she confessed, her voice a whisper, "scared that he'll never forgive me, scared of losing you and Alex to this hatred." Her admission shattered the last barriers I had put up to protect myself. I realized then that my role wasn't just to be a bystander. I needed to be her ally, Alex's support, and perhaps, find a way to reach my father. But the path to healing seemed obscured by the thick fog of past mistakes and present pain. Life at home had become a landscape of suspicion and bitterness. My father's distrust had deepened to a point where even the simplest acts of familial kindness were scrutinized and tainted with accusations. My mother's occasional visits to her mother's house, or her attempts to maintain some semblance of connection with her parents through gifts or phone calls, were not spared from my father's critical eye. He saw these gestures not as acts of love but as betrayals, further proof of conspiracies woven in his mind. One chilly afternoon, I returned from school to find the house unusually cold and quiet. My mother sat at the kitchen table, her face weary and lined with fresh worries. She looked up as I entered, managing a weak smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had been to visit Grandma, who was unwell, and had brought her some homemade soup and a warm blanket. When my father had learned of this, he exploded in rage, accusing her of wasting our scarce resources on her family, whom he now viewed almost as enemies. "Doesn't matter what I do, it's always wrong in his eyes," she confided in me, her voice breaking. "But I can't just stop caring for my mom, Mary. I can't." The situation with the phone calls was even worse. Every ring stirred a palpable tension in the air. My father, often fueled by his drunken stupor, would accuse my mother of conspiring with her brother, my uncle, despite my uncle having disappeared years ago. He couldn't seem to grasp that no one in the family had heard from him since he fled, leaving us to deal with the fallout of his actions. Each call, no matter the caller, seemed to him a ghostly echo of past betrayals, a reminder of the trust that had been broken and the financial security that had been stolen from us. Despite these overwhelming pressures, my mother continued to shoulder the responsibility of not just trying to keep our family together, but also ensuring that my two sisters and I could continue our education. My sisters, both younger than me, were in high school, facing their own battles with the ripple effects of our family's crisis. The cost of education was a constant worry, but my mother was determined that the chaos at home would not derail our futures. Seeing her struggle, I made the decision to take on a part-time job alongside my studies. I was now a freshman at a local community college, having chosen a school close to home to reduce expenses and stay near my family. My days were a blend of classes, studying, and working late shifts at a nearby cafe. Every paycheck I received went partly to help out at home and partly to cover my own educational expenses. This dual role of student and financial contributor was exhausting. There were nights I came home so tired that I could barely make it through dinner before falling asleep over my textbooks. Yet, seeing my mother's quiet gratitude and the way she fought to keep us all moving forward gave me the strength to keep going. She managed our meager finances with a precision and care that was nothing short of heroic, stretching every dollar to cover not just school fees but the basic necessities of life. Her resilience was our family's unsung melody, a quiet background score that pushed us all to persevere. My mother never complained about her lot, accepting each day's troubles with a resolve that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Her love for us was an unspoken promise, a commitment that she lived out by enduring the harsh words and the colder silences from my father. My younger sisters, witnessing all this, grew in their own resilience. We became a team, albeit a silent one, finding comfort in shared glances and quiet conversations away from the storms that frequently brewed in our living room. We helped each other with homework, shared responsibilities around the house, and saved little surprises for our mother, like the time we all chipped in to buy her a new book by her favorite author, hiding it under her pillow to find after a particularly hard day. In these moments, we found our pockets of peace, small oases of normalcy in a desert of chaos. My father's outbursts and suspicions became the storms we learned to weather, building stronger shelters in our bonds with each other. Each challenge, while painful, forged us into more than just siblings and a mother. It made us allies in a struggle that none of us had chosen but all of us were determined to survive. As I lay in bed each night, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling, I thought about my mother's sacrifices and my father's pain. The journey was far from easy, and many days, the burden of what we were enduring seemed too much to bear. But in the strength of my mother's unwavering love and the shared resolve of my sisters, I found a flicker of hope that perhaps, someday, we might find a way through the darkness, back to a place where love and trust could bloom once more in our family garden. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, the cafe bustling with the usual crowd of students and local professionals grabbing their midday coffee fix. As a waiter, I navigated through the tables with practiced ease, balancing trays filled with steaming beverages and the cafe's signature pastries. The hum of conversations mixed with the clatter of cups created a familiar soundtrack to my shifts. It was amidst this cacophony that I caught a glimpse of something, or rather someone, that froze me in my tracks. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure outside the large front window, a silhouette that was hauntingly familiar. The posture, the way he carried himself, it was unmistakably reminiscent of someone I had hoped to forget. My heart skipped a beat as I told myself it couldn't possibly be him. My uncle, the man responsible for so much of my family's misery, had reportedly fled abroad, a cowardly escape from the financial and emotional wreckage he had caused. Surely, I was mistaken. But as the figure approached and entered through the cafe's front door, the reality of his identity became undeniable. It was indeed my uncle. The shock of seeing him there, in flesh and blood, after all the rumors of his departure overseas, left me rooted to the spot. Time seemed to slow as he casually strolled up to the counter, oblivious to the storm of emotions his presence had stirred in me. Dressed incongruously in a crisply tailored suit that seemed to mock the ruin he had left behind, he appeared not only unscathed by the ordeal but prosperous. The fabric of his coat was fine, clearly expensive, with a sheen that caught the light as he moved. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and he wore a watch that glinted under the cafe's overhead lights, a stark contrast to the image of a bankrupt fugitive. As he ordered his coffee, chatting amiably with my coworker, a surge of anger welled up inside me. Here was the man who had betrayed his own sister, my mother, leaving her to shoulder the burden of his deceit. Her life had become a daily struggle to maintain some semblance of normalcy for us, her children, while he seemingly enjoyed the freedom purchased at our expense. My hands trembled slightly as I took in the sight of him, so at ease, so removed from the consequences of his actions. How could he stroll into my workplace, a place just a stone's throw from the school where I studied and worked to support my family because of the financial mess he had created? The unfairness of it all, the injustice, burned through me. I felt profound sorrow for my mother. She had aged visibly in the past few years, each day etching more lines of worry and exhaustion onto her face. Her nights were restless, often spent in tearful worry, her dreams haunted by the fallout of trusting her brother. And here he was, dressed in a suit that likely cost more than what she could spare on groceries in a month. As my uncle took a seat with his coffee, I wrestled with what to do next. Confronting him was my first instinct, to unleash the pent-up frustration, to tell him about the suffering his actions had continued to cause. Yet, as I watched him, a middle-aged man enjoying his coffee, seemingly content with his world, doubt crept in. What could a confrontation realistically achieve? After a few moments of internal debate, I approached his table, my resolve firming with each step. "Uncle James," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He looked up, his expression one of mild surprise that shifted quickly to recognition, and, fleetingly, something that might have been guilt. "Mary," he replied, his tone cautious. "It's been a long time. You've grown." "Yes," I said, the words tasting bitter. "A lot has changed since you left." We talked then, or rather, I spoke while he listened. I told him about the hardships we faced, about my father's decline and my mother's silent resilience. I spoke of the responsibilities that had fallen onto my shoulders far too early, the dreams that had to be adjusted and the family fabric that had been torn apart. He offered explanations, some semblance of regret, though whether it was genuine or not, I couldn't say. He spoke of bad luck and worse choices, of his own losses and regrets. But no apology could undo the damage, no words could reclaim the years of pain and hardship his deceit had wrought upon us. The conversation ended with no dramatic resolution, no promises of restitution. He left, and I returned to my duties, the encounter leaving a mix of sadness and catharsis. I hadn't changed anything, not really, but speaking my truth had lightened something within me. The afternoon had taken a turn I could never have anticipated. After meeting with my uncle at the cafe, I returned home filled with a mix of emotions. It felt important to share the encounter with my mother, to relay not just his words but the sheer normalcy with which he had presented himself. My mother listened quietly, her expression somber, absorbing every detail with a heavy heart. As I spoke, her eyes reflected a deep sadness, a well of emotions that seemed too vast and complex for words. She was silent for a long time, the air between us filled with unspoken thoughts and lingering heartache. It was a silence that spoke volumes, resonating with the weight of all we had endured, all that had been broken and lost because of my uncle's actions. Suddenly, the fragile quiet was shattered by a loud, angry voice. My father, who had been out of sight but not out of earshot, stormed into the room. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes alight with the kind of fiery intensity that had become all too familiar. He had overheard everything, and the information acted like fuel on the already burning fire of his resentment. Without a moment's hesitation, he launched into a tirade. The words were harsh and unforgiving, aimed indiscriminately at my mother, my uncle, and all her relatives. He accused them once again of conspiracy and betrayal, his voice rising to a crescendo of fury and frustration. The pain and bitterness he felt towards my uncle were now tangled with a renewed sense of betrayal, knowing that my uncle was back and living seemingly without consequence. In his rage, he turned towards a shelf in our living room, one that held various family dishes and heirlooms, and began to smash them one by one onto the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain filled the room, each crash a hammer blow to the already fragile peace of our household. My mother's face crumpled in despair at the sight, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth to stifle her sobs. I stood frozen for a moment, shocked and scared by the intensity of my father's outburst. The room felt smaller somehow, as if each broken piece of dishware was a fragment of our family's unity, irretrievably damaged. Amidst the chaos, I found my voice, albeit shaky, and tried to intervene. "Dad, please stop. This isn't helping anything," I pleaded, my own voice edged with desperation. But my words seemed to fuel his anger further. He turned his wrath towards me, accusing me of siding with traitors and questioning my loyalty to our family. The accusations were like slaps to the face, harsh and stinging. I struggled to maintain my composure, to stand strong in the face of the storm. My mother, amidst her tears, tried to calm him, reaching out to touch his arm in a plea for peace. But he was beyond consolation, caught up in his own spiral of anger and hurt. The situation escalated until, finally, exhausted and spent, he left the room, leaving behind a trail of emotional and physical wreckage. The aftermath was a heavy silence, the air thick with the scent of dust and broken porcelain. My mother sank into a chair, her body racked with quiet sobs. I moved to her side, wrapping my arms around her in a silent offer of comfort and solidarity. Together, we mourned not just the dishes or even the peace of our afternoon, but something deeper, the loss of what our family had once been, the easy love and trust that had seemed unbreakable. In that moment of shared grief, my thoughts turned anxiously towards my younger brother, Alex. Known for his fiery temper and fierce protectiveness of our mother, I prayed he would stay away until the storm had passed. The last thing we needed was for him to come home and confront our father in his current state. The potential for violence was too great, the stakes too high. I didn't want this family conflict to escalate into something even more destructive. As we sat there, my mother and I, in the quiet aftermath, a profound sadness settled over me. It was a sadness for her, for all she had to endure, for my father, lost to his bitterness, and for Alex, who should have been spared from adult conflicts. I felt an overwhelming urge to protect them all, to somehow mend the fractures that had splintered through our family's foundation. But as I held my mother, feeling the tremble of her sobs, I knew that some things were beyond my ability to repair. The damage was done, the scars too deep. All I could do was offer my support, my love, and my presence, and hope that, somehow, it would be enough to help us navigate through the wreckage of our shared past into a future that, despite everything, I still hoped could hold some measure of peace and reconciliation. The morning after the turmoil at home, I found myself at the coffee shop, mechanically performing my duties but with my mind elsewhere. The image of my father's wrathful destruction and my mother's silent tears haunted me, playing over in my mind like a nightmarish loop. Despite the busy morning rush, a part of me remained disengaged, distant. It was during this haze of distraction that I noticed a familiar figure through the shop's window. My father was outside, walking back and forth along the street, his eyes scanning the faces of passers-by. Unlike his usual disheveled appearance marked by the telltale signs of his drunken escapades, today he was sober, his movements deliberate. The stark difference in his demeanor piqued my curiosity and concern. It wasn't long before I realized he was probably looking for my uncle, the man who had set off the chain of events that had led our family to this precipice. Compelled by a mix of worry and a desperate need to understand, I asked my manager if I could leave work early. Once outside, I kept a cautious distance, trailing behind my father as he continued his seemingly aimless search. After some time, he stopped at a small convenience store to buy a bottle of water. With the bottle in hand, he walked to a quieter part of the street, away from the bustling crowd. There, he squatted down and took a swig of water. It was then that I saw a vulnerability in him that I had never witnessed before, 2 lines of tears streaming down his face. Watching him at that moment, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Just the day before, he had been a tempest, a force of anger and destruction. Now, He seemed diminished, broken, crying like a child lost in a world too harsh and unforgiving. The sight of his tears, so raw and exposed, stirred in me a profound sadness. I wondered about the immense burden he must be carrying, the sheer weight of betrayal from a family member he had trusted implicitly. I didn't approach him. Instead, I turned away, allowing him his moment of private sorrow, and started the walk home, my own tears blurring my vision as I grappled with the pain of our fractured family. What had we done to deserve such a fate? The question echoed in my mind, each step towards home heavy with the gravity of our collective heartache. On impulse, I decided to take a detour to my grandmother's house. I needed a respite, a moment to gather strength from someone who might understand the depth of what we were facing. My grandmother welcomed me with her usual warmth, her keen eyes quick to see the distress in mine. As we sat together, I shared the events of the past few days, and in turn, she offered me insights into my father that I had not fully appreciated before. She spoke of the land, the piece of earth that had promised so much hope and potential. For my father, that land was not merely an investment, it was a testament to his dedication to providing for his family, a tangible representation of his love and commitment to our future. He had poured not just his money, but his dreams into that soil, dreams of security and prosperity for my sisters and me. It was supposed to be our legacy, a stable and secure foundation upon which we could build our lives. "Your father has always wanted the best for you girls," my grandmother said, her voice tinged with emotion. "He saw that land as a way to ensure you all had opportunities he never had. Losing it, especially the way we did, broke him more than you might realize." Her words shed light on the depth of my father's despair. It wasn't just anger or betrayal that fueled his actions, it was a profound sense of loss, not only of the land but of his role as our provider, of his identity as the man of the house. The loss had unmoored him, and what we saw, the rage, the helplessness, was his struggle to grapple with this new reality. As I listened to my grandmother, I felt a renewed sense of empathy for my father. Understanding the magnitude of his hopes and how deeply he felt their collapse helped me see past the fury and the broken dishes. It didn't excuse his actions, but it helped explain them, framing his outbursts as cries of pain rather than expressions of inherent cruelty. In the midst of our family's turmoil, as I watched the strain and sadness inflicted upon us by my uncle's deceit and my father's subsequent unraveling, I often found myself wrestling with conflicting emotions about what paths my mother should take. There were moments, many moments, when I felt that the only solution for her, and perhaps for all of us, was to sever ties with my father. The man who once filled our home with laughter and security had become a source of pain and instability. It seemed logical, perhaps even necessary, for her to consider divorce as a viable path to peace. Yet, despite my suggestions and perhaps even pleas, my mother never took that step. For a long time, I couldn't understand her decision. To me, it looked like an endless cycle of suffering, my father's bitterness and accusations, his thunderous outbursts that shattered more than just the physical tranquility of our home. It all seemed like too much for any one person to bear, especially someone as gentle as my mother. But as time wore on, and I witnessed more of the complexities of human emotions and the deep-seated bonds of marriage, I began to grasp the possible layers of her choice. My mother, with her enduring patience and almost unfathomable strength, perhaps saw beyond the surface of my father's wrath. Beneath his stormy veneer and the alcohol-fueled tirades, there was another man, a man she had loved and chosen to share her life with, a man who had once been the anchor of our family. She understood the depth of his despair, not just at the financial ruin that had befallen us, but at the profound sense of betrayal by his own brother-in-law, a man he had trusted implicitly. This betrayal had not just robbed him of a piece of land, it had robbed him of his dreams for our family's future, of his pride in providing for us, and of his mental peace. Understanding this, my mother likely felt that abandoning my father in his darkest hour would only add to the tragedy of our situation. Her commitment, then, was not just to the man he had become but to the man he once was and, perhaps, could be again. It was a choice of compassion over condemnation, of hope over despair. As for my uncle, the architect of our misfortune, my feelings were far less forgiving. The more I pondered on the devastation he had caused, the more a part of me wished him ill. It was a dark thought, and it shamed me at times. Wishing death upon another person, especially a family member, was a heavy, terrible thing. But in my lowest moments, it seemed a fitting end for someone who had so selfishly dismantled the happiness of his own relatives for his gain. Uncle James had not just stolen money, he had stolen our security, our joy, and our ability to look towards the future with hope rather than despair. The fact that he continued to live comfortably, seemingly indifferent to the chaos he had left in his wake, fueled a bitter fire within me. I imagined him facing some form of cosmic justice, where he would finally understand the full weight of the pain he had caused. Leaving my grandmother's house, I felt fortified by a mixture of love and sorrow. The road to healing our family would be long and uncertain, but armed with this new understanding, I felt slightly better equipped to face the challenges ahead. My father's tears and the wreckage at home were not just signs of what we had lost, but also markers of where we needed to begin rebuilding. As I approached our house, the sight of it no longer filled me with dread but with a resolve. We were broken, yes, but not beyond repair. With each step, I was making a silent vow to myself and to my family. I would not let our story end here, not in anger and despair. Somehow, we would find a way through the pain, guided by the understanding and love that still lingered beneath the scars, waiting to be rediscovered and nurtured back to life.